Coming up on Theater Talk.
I didn't drink for 5 or 6 months until I knew what the play was. I understood the enormity of the ask, both physical and emotional and vocally and every other way that the play asks a great deal from the actor playing Richard. I just can't imagine doing it absolutely faced.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation.
Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York.
From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm the producer, Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
So,
What, that wasn't sincere, Kevin?
No, it just sounded like you were an announcer at a racetrack. And now, Michael Riedel from the New York Post.
That's right. Watching Kevin Spacey.
Stepping up to the gate.
And there he goes,
they're up.
Richard III, right out of the gate. All right, I want to welcome our guest to Theater Talk, the terrific actor and someone I think I can call a friend, Kevin Spacey, who is really tearing up the stage at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in one of the great roles of all time, Richard III.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you very much.
All right, Kevin. I don't know if you remember this, but you gave me a tour of the Old Vic Theatre, where you were the artistic director in London a few years ago. And I asked you, all right, we were going by the pictures of all the greats, Gielgud, Olivier, in the Shakespearean performances there. And I said, what Shakespeare role do you have to do? And he said, you said there's gonna be a Richard III in my future.
Yeah.
Did you know very early on in your career as an actor that Richard III was gonna be a part you had to play?
Maybe when I was in high school and I was sort of involved in a lot of Shakespeare then. But oddly, I haven't done that much Shakespeare. I made my New York debut in Shakespeare in the Park, and I played 5 kind of parts.
Mm-hmm.
A tavern person, a guard, a warrior, a priest, and then I played a messenger and I had 5 lines. And then it wasn't until I did Richard II with Trevor Nunn at the Old Vic that I played a leading role in Shakespeare. So oddly, he hasn't played a huge part of my performing life. But as far as Richard goes, it's a funny thing. Maybe somewhere along the line, I think I stopped coveting parts. Like I stopped being somebody like, I've got to play that role before I die. So it's really been driven by what directors have said they want to see me do. And in the case of Richard II, I would have never thought of that play, but that was what Trevor wanted me to do. And when I found out he'd never directed it, I thought, well, that will be an interesting experience to have the first time for each of us. And Sam Mendes was desperate for me to do Richard, and it was one of many plays that we discussed and talked about. And ultimately, it was the one we decided to do.
I'm always interested in the physical deformity an actor chooses to play Richard. You have the hump,
Yes.
but in this case, you've decided to have a twisted, deformed leg. How'd you come up with that choice?
Well, Sam and I talked, quite a lot about other performances, and you're thinking, well, I don't want to do what someone else has done.
Ian McKellen famously did it with one hand.
Yeah, and so it was brilliant what he could do with his other hand. You look at Anthony Sher, whose performance was almost an incredible thing of endurance, because he was on these sort of sticks and looked like a spider. There were a couple things that were challenges, physical challenges. One was when Sam told me that we were going to be working on what's called a rake stage, which means it isn't flat, it's raised. So that puts every actor on stage in a place of being in balance. You are being pushed forward or sideways. So I had to think about that, being 10 months doing a play on different stages around the world. Stages a bit that we would build, but nonetheless, they sit differently in different theaters. And ultimately, I decided that I knew I wanted something to look like it was thin and spindly and deformed. So I realized that there would just be a visual trick by putting a brace on my costume. It would immediately shrivel the costume up, and it would look different from this full pant leg. So there's an automatic sort of twisted thing. But then when I was working in rehearsal and I was standing, can I stand up?
Yes, please.
I was standing in sort of in front of the mirror. I'm totally out of the light, sorry. I was standing in front of the mirror, and I couldn't see the brace. You could see the buckles. And I was like, well, oh, well, now I can see it. And then slowly I started to get on my toe and realized that by doing that, I was putting myself in balance. So I'm actually the only actor on stage who's in balance, but it allows me to move like a crab and move very, very quickly.
And you move that sideways crab-like way then.
Yeah, so I'm twisted and my body's twisted, and then I have a wilted hand, and I had them sort of make a mold of my hand and then put it in a glove so it never moves, and it's like a weapon, because I wanted to, the thing that really shifted it in a direction that ultimately I think became what it became psychologically for me as well as physically. I went, when I did the Nancy Hanks lecture in Washington, D.C. Last April, I went and I spent the day at the Walter Reed Hospital. I wanted to meet the soldiers who had just come back from Afghanistan or Iraq or even around the globe when accidents or terrorism happens. And I spent this day meeting, I don't know, maybe 40 men and women, young guys and girls who, you know, lost a limb, lost 2 limbs, you know, a bullet through their brain which has crushed their skull. And every single one of them, I heard, well, you know, I got this new arm and I got to learn how to use it, and I got this new leg, they're putting this foot tomorrow, but then I want to get back to my unit, you know, and then I got to get back to my unit. And you heard that and realized in later discussions with some of the doctors and psychologists that overcoming the disability is what they set out to do. And I thought that's exactly how I want to approach Richard. I want to be able to turn his disabilities into weapons so that he is able to achieve things and do things that you might not expect he could do. But like these, obviously their situation is much different. But just in terms of the psychology of understanding how does someone overcome something that either they're born with or that happens to them through no fault of their own. And I was very inspired by that, the notion of overcoming, and that was what ended up making, I wanted that a weapon, I wanted the stick to be a weapon, I wanted even his ability to move, to be able to do things that in the play would be frightening, because in actuality, Richard doesn't kill anyone in the play. You never see him do any of his murderous acts.
Right.
They're all done off stage. And there's a couple of moments that we built in to have a moment where you actually see what he's capable of, violently. I don't want to give those away, but there are places where you can see it.
Richard Thayer is such an interesting character because it depends on the actor's interpretation. You can play him straight through as the villain with the blackest of hearts. But I found your final speech, the pity speech, which I had not remembered, where Richard says, "Why should I expect anyone to pity me? I don't pity myself." And that, to me, is when it becomes a tragedy, that you suddenly do have sympathy for this villain. Choice that you made?
Yeah, and a choice that Sam and I talked a lot about, because, you know, it seems to me if you just listen to the words in the play, this is a man who's absolutely convinced that he has no conscience. And he's convinced of it for long periods of time. We took passages out of Henry VI and put them in where he talks literally about, I have no pity, no love, no fear. These things don't exist for me. But he's cursed. And at this time in the world, curses were taken quite seriously. The roles of the women in this play are incredibly strong. And if you remember back to the first scene where Queen Margaret shows up, beautifully played by Gemma Jones, she curses Richard and says, "No sleep close up that eye, unless it be during a tormenting dream." So this curse begins then, and even though he dismisses it, and then his mother curses him later on his way to battle, I believe these two things have an effect on him, and I wanted to be able to find out, is there a way to have this character wake up to a conscience after he has been through this nightmare where all of the people that he has murdered come to haunt him and to wish his death the next day in the battle. And by allowing that level of, oh, he actually is a human being, despite the things he's done and the murderous ways in which he has behaved, he's a human being. And even if people don't feel sympathy for him necessarily, there is suddenly a kind of empathy that I think just makes it for a really for me as an actor, it's an incredible journey.
And you meet the ending in an entirely different place as an audience member once you've done that. I must say, I've never seen a production of Richard III where the role of how women affect him and how women respond to him and affect him is contrasted with how the men who seem to just blindly follow him are affected by him.
Well, the women are reason and the men are out murdering.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, the Oliviers, the Gielguds, the Ralph Richardsons, when they played these roles, these guys back in the day, they were drinkers. You know these great old actors.
Yes.
And Chris Plummer was on the show once, and he said, you know, when I was a young man, the mark of being an actor was you did Hamlet in the matinee, and then you went off, and you had 2 bottles of claret for dinner, and you went on, and you did Hamlet again. Can you imagine, is it possible to play a part like this and drink the way some of these great old actors did?
I mean, maybe they stopped while they were doing something like Richard III, because, you know, we were talking earlier that this in some ways exposes Shakespeare as a young playwright. He was 28 years old when he read it, and he had not yet learned the lesson he learned later on as a writer, which is to give the leading actor breaks. So I've never been in a play as much as I'm in this play, and I quit drinking and everything as I started to prepare physically for the role. I trained for a number of months, and I didn't drink for 5 or 6 months until I knew what the play was. I understood the enormity of the ask, both physical and emotional and vocally and every other way that the play asks a great deal from the actor playing Richard. I just can't imagine doing it absolutely faced.
Afterward, then you need a break.
Imagine.
And you were saying earlier, I mean, you've traveled the world with this play, and you're a very close company. And, you know, actors have a great time after the show hanging out in bars. Do you have the stamina to just hang out with the actors? Or
If I don't have a show the next day, like matinee show, then yes, I can go out and have a nice time. And there's only been a couple of times when I've been stonkingly drunk. But I was in my flat, or I was, you know, where I was supposed to be. I wasn't out, you know, stumbling around. But yeah, I mean, look, there's nothing you can do but sort of marvel at those kinds of stories.
Yeah. Did you ever work with any of those actors who could really?
I've worked with a couple of drunks, sure.
Want to name any names, Kevin, while you're...
Oh, no.
I want to talk about your tenure at the Old Vic, because you have taken this famous theater, great storied Old Vic in London, and you have really put it at the center, not only of London theater, but also of New York theater. We had that wonderful production of the Alan Ayckbourn plays.
Norman Conquest.
Norman Conquest, that I absolutely love, that you produced on Broadway. And now we've got Richard III here. How much longer are you going to spend with the Old Vic?
I am there until 2015, and that will mean that I will have been artistic director for 11 years, but been associated with it for nearly 18.
What made you want to become an artistic director?
I don't know. I mean, my friends from high school would say, oh, this was always what you were meant to do, because I dreamed of running a theater, you know, when I was 15. And there's no doubt that when I started out in Shakespeare in the Park, and then later working for the Public Theater, and Joe Papp had an influence, watching Joe, the way in which he did things, the way in which he fundraised, the political activism he had. And I think the fact that he believed so strongly that the theater was for the public, which is why he named his theater The Public. And I felt like I was at a point in my life when I'd had this you know, sort of journey in trying to see whether I could be a movie actor, and that had gone better than I could have possibly hoped. And I was like, well, what am I going to do for the next 10 years? Am I going to spend, you know, my time sort of trying to do what I see actors do, which is to stay in those lists and be in those things and be... And I was like, you know, I've sort of done that, and I wanted to do something that was bigger than myself, bigger than my own career, bigger than my ambition had been when I was starting out. And the idea of a company, running a company, of doing something that is about that, and trying to build a body of work and a strong enough foundation that that theater will continue as a producing house long after I'm gone.
I've talked to Charlie Spencer, the Telegraph, and he, you know, they say Kevin has done amazing stuff at the Old Vic. And the initial thing, they were like, who's this movie star coming over to run one of the most famous theaters in England? I mean, there was a lot of resistance in the press for when you first arrived.
Yeah, a little bit. But the truth is, if you, we've talked about this before, but if you do as much research as I did about theatrical beginnings, you quickly realize that nothing is welcomed. They didn't want the Globe. They didn't want Olivier. They didn't want a National Theater. You know, everybody has had their critics, and in a way, you know, I just kept saying to our staff, keep our heads high. We have a 10-year vision, and we'll get through. Anyone that wants to judge a company in 18 months is not giving it a fair shot. It takes years to build a reputation in an audience.
Robert Moses didn't want free Shakespeare in the Park. That was the big battle that Joe Papp had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In that theater, when I was walking around with you, the Old Vic, I loved it so much. Do you have a sense of those great actors walking around that building still when you're working there? I mean, you walk on that stage, and this is where Olivier did.
It's not only that, it's not only in the theater itself, which is a very, very special and unique place in British history, but also in just feeling. You feel on that stage supported, encouraged, led along by those that have stood on that stage before. But you also feel it in the hallways, you feel it in the dressing rooms, you feel it in the rehearsal room. You know, there's a photograph of Olivier and Vivien Leigh and Robert Halpern and a whole bunch of people in the rehearsal room rehearsing Richard III in the same room that we rehearsed Richard III in. To give you a sense of the continuity of this theater, although the bridge that really needs to be gapped even more. One of the last times the Old Vic Theatre Company went to Sydney, Australia was in 1948 when Olivier and Vivien Leigh took Richard III there. And we just went back all these years later. Companies don't tour that much, and they certainly don't tour around the world that much.
That's right.
We have a nice exchange between
the Bridge Project
London
here
and New York.
And Band. Yeah.
But it's been the most extraordinary thing to have an opportunity to go around the world with an Old Vic English language production and give people in Beijing and Singapore and Istanbul and Naples and Qatar, Doha, in San Francisco, an opportunity to experience this play, and we're very happy to.
Speaking of arts advocacy, I'm going to change the subject a little bit. I heard a wonderful speech that you did, the Nancy Hanks lecture in Washington last year, where you're talking about the advancing arts and culture and why it's important. You were lobbying, really, in Washington, weren't you, for the importance of
Did it fall on deaf
of
ears?
the arts education.
Is Washington receptive to
Yeah.
your pleas?
Well, you know, there are about as many people who are receptive to it as those who oppose it. Look, I believe, as you can go back and look at the history of civilization and say that any nation that has discarded the arts or discarded culture has not been a very rich and diverse nation. That culture and arts are a part of who we are as a society. It is the greatest thing that we exchange around the world. Countries may go to war, but it's culture that unites us. And it's the things that we talk about. And so I have always believed that there should be a role in government in supporting the arts. And certainly President Kennedy knew that, the hall I was at when I gave that speech. Look, the one thing I did learn when I was down in Washington is that I could never go into politics. Because it's so hard to get anything done. And I like to get things done. I think I'd be incredibly frustrated by that.
Yeah, I think Rocco Landisman, who's the head of the NEA now, is experiencing this.
Well, when I saw him in April, he liked it. You know,
But
he was
you-
really enjoying his role.
You bring up yourself as a model in this speech, and you talk very poignantly, I would have to say, about your own insecurities as an adolescent and how arts education was totally responsible.
It's so responsible
for you.
from my experience, but it's responsible for so many, not just actors and people that have gone into the performing arts. And look, it isn't about whether or not kids are going to go into the performing arts, because frankly, if somebody wants to be in the arts, you're not going to be able to stop them.
That's right.
Right? But it's about what these programs and these experiences and these workshops can do for a young person's sense of self-esteem and their sense of collaboration. Even in maybe how they view themselves. It's about standing up in a room and being able to, wow, I can actually communicate. And I think that's better for society no matter what business someone decides to go into. And you know, we instituted at the Old Vic, when I first started, a program of tickets for young kids to be able to come and see our plays, because one of my arguments, and I will be making it until the day I die, that I'm so disappointed that Broadway and the West End has become an exclusive club.
That it's so elitist.
That you do not have every night the amount of tickets for students that you should. You don't put them in the front row, which is where you should sit them so they feel special and that they'll have an experience they'll never forget. And part of what is the short-sightedness of it is that that is exactly how you're going to build the next generation of theatergoers. And if you don't do it, if you don't start to make it affordable and inviting, we will lose them all to so many other forms of
So
entertainment.
what do we do? Because basically, I mean, Michael has told me at one point that the producers would rather have the empty seats in the balcony than reduce those tickets. I mean, it's like they don't
I asked the
care.
producer, I said, how many premium price seats do you want to sell? And he said, as many as we can.
All right, so then let's take it out of the producer's hands. Let's put it in the theater owner's hands.
Occupy Broadway.
Oh, my dear, the theater
Oh,
owners,
no.
they want those seats to be $750.
I'm well aware of that, but
On this subject, if I'm not mistaken, I remember the producer Manny Eisenberg, who's a friend of yours and who produced that great Iceman Cometh you did on Broadway. He once told me that you guys had kicked around the idea of getting a Broadway theater and turning it into sort of a rep house where you and other prominent actors could come and do the plays you wanted to do. It sounds to me like a fine idea. Is that still possible, or did you meet resistance from the theater owners who would just rather...
no, I mean, ultimately what ended up happening is I went to London and started a
found your
theater
own
company. Yeah.
You solved the problem.
But look, it certainly interests me, and maybe even before I'm done at the Old Vic, to come to New York, to maybe take over a Broadway theater, to do an entire Old Vic season.
Great idea.
To, first of all, solidify the Old Vic's reputation and place in New York for the next artistic director. And also just to be able to celebrate the sort of, what will be 11 years of my time there. But look, you run into all of the difficulties of why Broadway is so expensive. You'd have to be able to go and make some significant kind of deals with the unions in order to be able to make it work. And I think, we proved with the Bridge Project, we proved with some of the other shows that we've done, and some of the arrangements I've been able to make when I've brought shows here to have student seats. I think you can do it, and I've managed to prove with both Iceman Cometh and Moon from the Misbegotten that you can make a profit on Broadway and still provide 200 seats for young kids every night.
Not just the, the lottery side
In the
of
back
it.
and behind the pillar.
We got to wrap it up, but I do want to ask you, you in the speech that Susan mentioned, the Nancy Hanks speech, you said the importance of the arts in your life. Can you be a little more specific and tell us a certain moment when you were a kid where you realized this is the place I want to be, and it's giving me the self-esteem that you believe it can do?
Yeah, I used to, I grew up at a time when there was a lot of funding in arts in schools. And so the kinds of workshops and festivals and seminars and experiences I got to have in going to the theater and seeing Katharine Hepburn in a play, or Jack Lemmon in a play, which I did when I was 13, and doing a workshop with him specifically. And we had to do a scene from a play, and when we were done with that, Jack Lemmon, who was running this workshop, walked up to me and put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "That was a touchy terrific." He said, "You're an actor." And he encouraged me to go to New York and encouraged me to study. And I can't tell you what that meant to me as a relatively shy 13-year-old who dreamed of being an actor, to have an idol of mine put his hand on my shoulder and sort of say, "This is what you should do for your life." So why I do all the workshops that I do now, why we started this program through this production of Richard III, we have an educational program called Richard's Rampage, which a foundation that I've started, the Kevin Spacey Foundation, has paid for all of the work that we've been doing all over the world. And we have sort of 3 strands of the work: on stage, which are workshops that I do; in schools, which we have our practitioners go and work with young kids in schools; and then online. And it's been incredible to be able to offer to all these kids all over the world a chance to come and see Richard for free, to do these Q&As, to do these workshops.
To have you teach them.
To have me come and do a workshop as well. I'm telling you, every time I'm in these workshops, and every time some moment happens where you see a kid, like the nickel drops, and suddenly they have the courage to express themselves in a way that they maybe never have before, I'm flown back to what it was like for me. And I see myself. I know what those kids are going through. I know exactly that feeling. And that feeling is maybe just a seed. It's maybe just a little seed. But if it's watered, if it's nurtured, if a kid like that is encouraged, there is no telling what that person might end up doing in their life, whether or not they go into the arts.
If
And so I'm a big believer of that.
If Jack Lemmon or Kevin Spacey puts a hand on the shoulder and says, that was good, it begins.
Yeah, but it's not just about me or Jack. It's about what I know and I see these kids are getting from these practitioners that they're working with, these two wonderful actors, Annie and Johnny, who've been doing this work in all these schools. It's just, for me, Jack Lemmon said, he had a philosophy that he passed down to me, which is that if you've done well in the business you wanted to do well in, then it is your obligation to spend a good portion of your time sending the elevator back down. And I always thought that was a pretty succinct way of saying it. So that's our logo at the Kevin Spacey Foundation, is sending the elevator back down.
Excellent, excellent. Kevin Spacey, artistic director of the Old Vic, arts advocate, and a terrific Richard III at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. I can see you maybe in the NEA spot at some point.
You must be drinking.
Great having you. Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks.
Curse not thyself, fair creature.
I would I were to be revenged on thee!
It is a quarrel most unnatural to be revenged on him that loveth thee.
It is a quarrel just and reasonable to be revenged on him that killed my husband!
Our thanks to the Friends of Theatre Talk for their significant contribution to this production.
Theatre Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theatre Talk. Thank you and good night.